You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am super excited to have Matthew Pearl on the show. He has an amazing new book. It's called The Taking of Jemima Boone, Colonial Settlers, Tribal Nations, and the Kidnap That Shaped America. Matthew, I have to tell you that this book completely took me by surprise in the best way possible. We talk about historical stories all the time, and one of the dangers that as you progress through time is we're now living in the 21st century, and if we're talking about history from the 1700s, the farther we get away from those events, the more they get reduced to kind of bullet points. When we're in school and learning history and things like that, because there's just too much history to cover. And so we run the risk of losing stories that made us who we are. And that's what The Taking of Jemima Boone just completely took me by surprise, because these are stories that we don't get to hear, and nuance that is lost to history. I love this book so much. I'm recommending it to everyone. I'm giving it as gifts to some people this year in our gift giving season. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Thank you so much for having me, Hank, and for such kind words. That means a lot to me. This was a new challenge for me as a writer, coming out of fiction, which is what I've done previously to this, at least in the book format. I've written nonfiction, and specifically narrative nonfiction, before in articles, long form articles. But this is my first narrative nonfiction book, so it means a lot to me on that level. And as is the case with all writers, each book means something different to you, because it unfolds as a process at a different part of your life, right? And a different stage of your life. So it also has meaning in all kinds of personal ways. But I really appreciate what an eloquent way that you stated really what my goals were with this book, which were to immerse and transport us into not sort of a bird's eye view of history, but a really specific moment that to me was incredibly compelling the more I explored it.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want to dig into all everything surrounding the story and how you came to discover it. But before we do that, we begin each show with the same question, and we have to do that. It's part of the show. That question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
That's a great question, and I always wonder about our memories in general, mine specifically, how much we are able to remember moments as they actually happened in real time, or how much we fill in those blanks, right? as we reflect on our life. And I'll say this: I live in South Florida now. It's where I grew up. In between, I lived for most of my adult life in the Boston area. Very different places. Wonderful things about both places. Challenges in both places. But getting right to your question, one of the big differences was that when you're in Boston, Cambridge, where I lived, you would go into a coffee shop where I did a lot of my writing, including some of the writing for this book, and surrounding you are writers. You might know some of them, you might not, but you can see them writing, right?
Yeah.
See them working on a novel, on plays, discussing it, having meetups to kind of compare notes. Where I grew up, and as a child growing up, I never met a writer. So, and in fact, because Florida was at that time, and the space program has kind of disappeared and maybe coming back. But when I was growing up, the space program, for example, was always a big deal in Florida, even though we weren't right at that area. But I always think how I met multiple astronauts before I ever met a writer. Because they'd come and they'd speak to our school. So the idea of being a writer wasn't even on my radar growing up. Like almost anything, definitely going to space seemed more realistic to me than being a writer. And part of that, I think, is that as we begin to read books in school, and I was not an early reader in terms of kind of seeking out books to read. I would kind of do what I was told or read what I was told, and it took quite a while, really, until high school, when I was actively, maybe voraciously looking for more books. But when we read books in school, it's so often people from so long ago, people who are dead. So it was very hard for me to ever conceive of that idea of being a writer, really, until not even college, because I ended up being an English major, but again, studying these writers that I revered, that I worshipped. How could I be one of them, right? That was kind of how my brain worked looking back. It was really once after college when I was in law school, and I didn't end up being a lawyer, but when I was in law school, I'm not super happy with my track in life or my trajectory that I found myself in, that I started missing an outlet, a creative outlet, and decided to try writing.
So you, the new book, The Taking of Jemima Boone, is narrative nonfiction, but you have written and published a number of novels before this one. What would you describe your niche in fiction? Where do you feel like you fit?
I have written historical fiction, largely geared toward literary history, with really one exception. One of my 6 novels, which is called The Technologist, was a thriller set around the founding of MIT, so kind of the origin of scientific education, which was considered a very dangerous experiment, believe it or not, at the time. But all of the others take a part of literary history. My first one was called the Dante Club, which I ultimately did a sequel to called the Dante Chamber. There's one called the Poe Shadow, one called the Last Dickens, one called the Last Buccaneer, and all of them, even in the title, sort of gesture toward a moment in time in which literature is being created, which I weave in thriller and mystery elements to kind of make that come alive. And I think a lot of that ties into what I was saying just a few moments ago as we were chatting. This idea for me of exploring what it means to be a writer, because I didn't grow up dreaming of being a writer. I think once I started to write, part of what I was doing in my writing was trying to understand what it meant to write as your kind of creative outlet, as your professional platform. And so for me, those historical thrillers are also, I think, if I psychoanalyze myself, serving that purpose of understanding not just a writer as a name on a book that we read, but what it means to be a writer as a person, right? And using, in the cases of my historical novels, using writers that are kind of iconic to explore that.
So taking these iconic characters and bringing them to life, what is it? What was that? Growing up in South Florida, and then moving to the Boston area, was there a sense of history that came from Boston that made you want to connect to the past? I guess what I'm asking is, do certain places have an intrinsic pull that makes you want to dig into to our past? If that makes sense at all.
That's a great question. I think that's absolutely right. In my case, Boston was a kind of beacon for me in terms of imagining how we might re-enter that history, because so much of that history is visible and present. I mean, Florida has incredible history of the Ponce de Leon and St. Augustine, and it's some of the oldest history in our country. On the other hand, the history is not very visible. You're
Right.
not very often you're not sort of seeing it or walking through it. Whereas in a place like Boston, it's more like cities in Europe, where you really are feeling that you're entering it. Although Europeans would kind of laugh that in Boston we think a structure or a house from 150 years ago is old, right?
Right.
But I also think that sense of place doesn't always have to be present for us as writers or readers. It could be a place that's always intrigued us, but maybe we've never been there. Maybe we haven't had access to it, especially in the last couple of years when travel has become so different. And there's lots of ways to explore history, fiction and nonfiction, I think, without tethering ourselves or putting the pressure on ourselves, because I think that's something we do a lot as writers, to say, well, I have to live in this place, or I have to have visited this place this many times to really understand it, to be, to have an authoritative voice in writing about it. I also think, so on the one hand, I think it's really healthy to explore your surroundings, to let that inspire you, but also I think we should keep a very open mind about how there's so many ways, again, fiction and nonfiction, to explore stories, past and present.
So with your previous novels and the way you explored real living people like Edgar Allan Poe or Dante, and you use those works to kind of revisit those people and to bring them to life and to kind of play the what if game in a lot of ways. The Taking of Jemima Boone is you don't approach it the same way, because this is a narrative nonfiction. You are true to the actual story, and you don't play the what if game. First off, how did you discover this story, and what was it about? How did Daniel Boone come to you, and when did you start seeing all the layers to this story?
Absolutely. The origin story of this project for me actually does dovetail with earlier projects, because I entered it through literature. I was always curious. I am always curious where fiction comes from. What analogs we have for our fiction, particularly the fiction that we grow up with, or that are kind of iconic pieces of literature. And in that arena, The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper caught my eye, and over the years I explored where that came from, and one of its primary influences was this incident that forms the heart of The Taking of Jemima Boone, which is the kidnapping of Daniel Boone's daughter Jemima and two of her friends. And what often happens is that when famous literature is inspired by something in real life, that real life event or events kind of sink below the surface. They almost get replaced or substituted for by the literature that we get to know, right? And that becomes part of popular culture. So when I dug into this, I found that was very much the case with this, that the true story of this kidnapping was incredibly suspenseful, exciting, interesting, compelling, important, complicated. And I became more and more interested in sort of finding a way to tell that story. And one rule of thumb I have in having written in fiction and nonfiction is, and by the way, someone could totally push back on this or disagree with it. I'm very much not dogmatic about anything in writing, because I think each of us as writers and readers are coming from a very different place. But my general rule of thumb is, if something can be nonfiction, and can be successful storytelling as nonfiction, do it as nonfiction. I kind of reserve fiction for stories that need that something else to make it come alive. So in this case, it really felt to me the perfect project for what I had been looking for, which is to try out a book-length narrative nonfiction.
You have an amazing story idea. You execute the writing and editing flawlessly, and now the only thing missing are readers. We can help you go from author to author superhero with Story Origin. Story Origin is a one-stop shop for marketing tools with a community of amazing authors working together to find reviewers, build mailing lists, increase sales, and collect feedback from beta readers. Everything an author needs, all in one place, from providing review copies or beta copies, reader magnets to ensure you stay connected with readers, easily distribute audio promo codes, universal retail links to send readers directly to the proper point of purchase, or provide direct download links for members of your mailing list. Story Origin has all the tools you need in one easy-to-use site. Use the promo code ASP21 at checkout when subscribing to the yearly plan, and you will get 10% off your first year. This code will expire December 31st, so hurry over and subscribe now. StoryOriginApp.com.
Do you have a process for when you discover an historical character that you want to dig into? Maybe it's Dante, maybe it's Poe, maybe it's Jemima Boone. Is there a process that you start digging into to see if there is a nugget of a story there? And if so, was the process like that for this book? Did the process lead you to the point where you said, okay, I don't need to make up any story here. There's enough that I can dig, and this is a fascinating enough story that it stands on its own.
Exactly. In this case, I think it would be different for every project or every pixel of history that you're looking at. In this case, as I explored the material, I found it just grew in interest for me. Sometimes you'll jump into something and the part that catches your eye will be really exciting, and the more you dig into it, the less there is. Right? It doesn't move. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't grow as kind of storytelling ingredients. In this case, it was just the opposite. And what I was able to identify for myself as a storyteller was, first of all, that this was often a footnote, maybe literally a footnote in the history of the frontier, or the history of Daniel Boone or Kentucky, or maybe just 2, 3, 4 pages in a 400, 500 page book about Daniel Boone, right, or about the frontier. And what very often happens, I find, with material in history is that a series of events or incidents can get absorbed by larger sweeping stories, right? And we lose something there. It makes sense that happens, but by zeroing in, and this is the way these are the types of stories I love reading the most, and that I really enjoy taking a crack at writing when I have those opportunities to zoom in on a moment or moments. In this case, it's about 2 years, starting with the kidnapping and then following that to sort of a chain reaction of events that include another kidnapping, include a kind of outright warfare, and a court-martial trial, to kind of simplify it. Once you zoom in on that, so rather than it being 5 or 6 or 10 pages in a much larger sweeping work, it brings out a new life to it. It animates it. It lets us immerse ourselves into it. It lets us it lets the story become experiential, where we really feel we're stepping into it and living it with those characters, and to get to know those characters. Jemima, to me at least, always in the material that I was able to find was just kind of a cardboard cutout, a stand-in, or just a throwaway name. And one of my goals with this was to bring her alive, to bring the tribal warriors alive that were involved, to bring Daniel Boone alive at that moment as a father, and what's wrapped up in that, and be able to of course I have to know all I can know about Daniel Boone, but I don't have to feel the responsibility of covering everything from the time Daniel Boone was born till the time he dies, right? Because that's what creates a very different type of work.
So with the novels that you've written, you've had lots of practice with the narrative side. You can tell a story, and you have you've honed that craft. But with narrative nonfiction, you need to have reliable sources, I would think, so that you have enough material that you can weave that story together truthfully, and that it can stand on its own as an authoritative work. With an event like this that happened almost 250 years ago, how reliable are those sources for this event? Like, how difficult was it to dig up things that you could trust?
Yeah, it's a great question. You're absolutely right. And there are plenty of times you might approach a story and discover, wow, there's just no sources on this, or there's not enough sources on this. And by the way, that might be an example of a writing project that turns to fiction for help, right? Where we can infuse and fill in the void that sources that perhaps just never existed or no longer exist. In this case, I was very fortunate because the frontier was heavily studied at soon after the sort of era of the frontier by multiple people, especially two people in particular, one named Draper, who collected materials. So they were not writers so much. They were really more collectors of letters, of manuscripts. They would sit down and interview people. So this sort of small handful of people did this for years. And part of what you have to immerse yourself in researching it is the level of reliability, right? How much do you trust those collectors? Where can you spot flaws in how they're gathering the information, or how they present it in kind of archival or printed format? How much do you trust those witnesses, and what are their biases? And so all of this, and you can also build that into the reading experience, right? As I do time to time in the Taking of Jemima Boone, where I'll flag something. I'll say, this likely romanticized, one likely romanticized observation about this moment is such and such, right? So I'm still able to include that as a narrative building block, but flag for the reader that we might be a little wary of taking it literally, right? Might be the only thing we have for that moment. So it's a real process, first of determining whether there's enough source material, and then of sorting out without making the reader do the work, right? If we're academic writers, we're going to be doing a very different project, and some of that is to make the reader do a lot of the work, and that's not what we're trying to do with narrative nonfiction, at least not in my mind. We're trying to create a reading experience not dissimilar from a novel, that we can escape into and we can enjoy, and the writer can have the tedious work and the reader doesn't have to share in that, but everything has to be accurate, of course, because it's nonfiction, but can be qualified when necessary, rather than burden the reader by saying this might have happened, or this might have happened. We don't know in this, right? Then we're taken out of the story. So it still falls to the writer to make those choices.
Matthew, as the writer, when you're tackling a project like the Taking of Jemima Boone, as opposed to a project like the Dante Club or even the Technologist, What is the preparation phase? How does it differ between these books? I would imagine, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that when you're writing a book like Jemima Boone, there would be a lot of work in the pre-writing phase, a lot of gathering of sources and things like that, and then you kind of figure out where that narrative thread takes you, as opposed to the Dante Club or the Technologist. Maybe the writing process is different for a book like that. How do they differ?
It's a really interesting question. For me, my novels have always been research based. So, and I always loved the research. So there's plenty of people, understandably, who are not particularly happy to be drowning in research, right? I always really liked that process and probably did much more than I needed to in terms of gathering material for my novel. So I think that in my particular instance, that was really great preparation as I started to include more and more narrative, more and more nonfiction writing. So I could carry over the narrative skills, as you mentioned, but also I already had a head start in how to collect and keep track of the actual research. Now, where it did become noticeably different was that is that in nonfiction you have to keep track of where every few words are coming from, like what source is providing you the information that is justifying and verifying each part of these sentences, right? And one sentence might have 4 sources embedded in it, right? So it was actually on a logistical level, one thing I had to adjust to, because in fiction there's no apparatus, right? You're not, unless you're writing some kind of avant-garde novel, there's no endnotes, there's no footnotes, there's no bibliography. So even though I was always very conscientious about research for my fiction and about making historical fiction as authentic as I could be, not that you have to, you can write historical fiction that does not do that, but that was what I enjoyed reading and writing.
Sure.
But you didn't have to keep track of it. There was no obligation that on page 53 of this novel what your source is for, how much it costs to eat at this restaurant in 1859, right? No, someone might ask you, but you have no responsibility to that. And you might want to keep track for yourself. With nonfiction, you have to keep track of every single little dot. So the reason that's so hard is that, as you know, when we write, we're not writing our final draft, right? When we begin to write. So how do you keep track of those things and still allow your writing, which is always a fluid process, the actual craft of the writing, as fluid in nonfiction as it is in fiction, to of how you're going to communicate this, how you're going to structure this. I'm going to move this part of this sentence, this. So it's kind of a minor sort of side note, I guess, but that gave me some headaches.
So now that the new book is the writing phase is over, all the editing is done, the publication phase is done. It's now out and available to the world, and you have turned your sights to the next project. Do you find yourself wanting to do another narrative nonfiction project? Did this excite you and kind of whet your appetite for things to come, or are you ready to dive back into fiction?
Thanks for asking. It's something I think about a lot. I actually have felt a shift toward nonfiction. I never want to rule out writing more fiction, but I've felt the shift for a while of my brain kind of pointing itself more and more toward nonfiction. My wife actually published her first book last year, which was narrative nonfiction, which she discovered in doing her family research, a book called Terror to the Wicked, about a trial in colonial Plymouth colony in Massachusetts, a murder trial, sort of the first murder trial. And I now have co-founded and I edit a digital magazine with my co-founder Greg Nichols called Truly Adventurous. And Truly Adventurous is, as the title sounds, is a home and a platform for narrative nonfiction. I've written a couple stories. We've done. We've been around for about 2.5 years, but for the most part, it's a platform for other writers. And I'm one of the editors and one of the people who looks for the writers, looks for the stories, matches those up, works with the writers. So I think recently I've kind of saturated myself in nonfiction, and probably that's the direction I'll be going in for a while.
Nice. I can't wait to see what's coming next. Matthew, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you're up to, where can they connect with you online?
Sure. My website is matthewpearl.com, so easy to remember. And I'm also Matthew Pearl on Twitter. I'm not a huge social media person, which is one of my many flaws, probably. It's
or not, depending.
I don't know. More and more, it's something that's expected of writers, and it can be healthy in so many ways. I think there's ways in which it can be oppressive, and maybe that's just stating the obvious, and maybe the obvious kind of challenge with social media, but I could definitely be found there too. And I'd love your listeners to also check out Truly Adventurous, where again a lot of my work goes into that. And it's one of the exciting things about nonfiction is that there's always more stories to find that are out there, whether they happened hundreds of years ago or yesterday.
Absolutely. Well, we will put links in the show notes of this episode where they can connect with you at your website or Truly Adventurous or all those great places that we talked about. The Taking of Jemima Boone, when you're hearing this, is available everywhere. You can grab it in physical paper copy if you want to hold it in your hand and then put it on your shelf for everyone to see, or Kindle edition. Is it also going to be an audiobook, Matthew?
Yes, it is.
Excellent. Well, we'll put links where you can grab it in any format that you like in the show notes of this episode. Matthew, this has been so much fun chatting. I love the book. I'm telling everyone about it. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you, Hank. This was a pleasure.
Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
No use crying over spilled milk. Eliza hated that cliche. She'd grown up a cliche, her life a bowl of cherries, duck soup, easy as pie, child's play behind a white picket fence. Mother had been the Wyatt Earp of cliches, firing them off quick draw. A rotten apple spoils the barrel. Smile and the world smiles with you. Every dog has his day. Children should be seen and not heard. She believed them all, particularly this last. Eliza obliged, preferring to wander the streets of Wytheville, Virginia, on her own lonesome terms. The divorce left Laura a spinster librarian, and one false step on icy stairs left her an invalid as well. The accident happened on New Year's Eve, 1950. Laura had just locked the doors of Wytheville Public Library. We must make black-eyed peas tomorrow, Laura had been thinking, with turnip greens. That ensured a lucky new year, and if you swept some money over your threshold, a prosperous one, too. She loved those old Southern traditions. She looked both ways, checking for Negroes, but turned a heel on the icy marble of the stairs and fell into the bushes below, breaking the long bones in both legs. Eliza had taken advantage of her mother's absence. She'd lost her virginity that same night. She'd swept Ron Partridge over her threshold, initiating her own beloved tradition. She was nursing a hangover, giddily reliving the event. But around 8:30 she realized that her mother had not come down to breakfast. She checked her mother's bedroom, found it empty, took the bus down to the library, climbed the high stairs, knocked hard on the library doors, and heard a groan below. Laura lay under the William Penn barberry bushes, below the yellow-trimmed windows of the nonfiction section. Her white stockings ran Jezebel red with blood. Sweat and melted snow had soaked her blouse, and her gray forehead blazed. The broken bones didn't kill Laura Merrick. She lay in the hospital, wheezing, her legs mortared up in casts. She had few visitors after the first week. Her church group was glad to fret over a poor thing for a day or two, but they trickled away when Laura had the bad manners to linger. On Valentine's Day, as her mother slept, Eliza drew big sloppy hearts on her casts. Laura harumphed when she woke and insisted on keeping her legs hidden beneath blankets afterwards. But in late March, something miraculous happened. Laura's self-control dropped. She ranted at nurses, spit at doctors, swore like a Navy pilot dropping F-bombs on Hiroshima. She had dementia, the doctors said. Eliza decided that her mother had just stopped believing her own bullshit. The spells continued over the next 2 weeks, and Eliza enjoyed her mother's company for the first time. They swapped bawdy jokes, ogled the handsome interns, and chattered like best girlfriends late into the evening. They had long conversations, and Laura spoke her own mind in her own words about things that mattered to her. It broke Eliza's heart when the prim, condescending librarian returned. Laura hardly acknowledged anything that had passed between them. The clichés returned. You can't have your cake and eat it too. A leopard doesn't change its spots. Nothing is certain except death and taxes. This last proved true. On April 15th, Laura Merrick marked her Bible with a tongue depressor, set it on her nightstand, leaned back against the headboard, and coughed blood down the front of her nightdress. Eliza found her that way, dead as the proverbial doornail, and yes, the blood was thicker than water, just as her mother had always said. Much thicker than water, in fact, perhaps as thick as molasses in January.